Hello and good evening. I'm Melissa Idris.
And I'm Sharad Kuttan.
Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. Investigative journalist Lalita Kunaratnam was issued a letter of demand by MACC Chief Azam Baki following the publication of 2 articles which raised questions surrounding his acquisition of shares in public listed companies. Now, along with investigative journalists, whistleblowers have played a key role in exposing graft and misconduct. But have they always been afforded the protection that politicians pay lip service to? Let's speak now to an anti-graft activist. Cynthia Gabriel is the Executive Director of the Centre to Combat Corruption and Cronyism, better known as the C4 Centre. Cynthia, when you look at this controversy surrounding the MACC, I'm just wondering what strikes you most about the attitudes of officials towards those who have raised concerns, either through official channels or through the media.
Thank you very much. Well, this latest scandal is one really very, very grave scandal, mainly because it concerns the Anti-Corruption Commission itself and none other than the Chief Commissioner himself. So it is a really very, very concerning issue in the country. Now, the scandal that has erupted and a lot of the brouhaha that has happened over the last couple of days actually also centers around the very important work of an investigative journalist that we have known, and she has worked with us for a while, but she's no longer with us. She left us in December 2020. So this entire work of piecing the pieces, conflict of interest, issues of corporate beneficial ownership, etc., was brought to light because of her good work. And it is not every day that a whistleblower is ready to be identified the way she placed her name onto an article with so many damning details. So this is a real act of bravery, a real act of courage, and in an environment which is very, very disenabling, an environment that is hostile, in fact, that does not protect the whistleblower, even though we have a Whistleblower Protection Act. And that's the irony of it all, because we ratified the UN Convention Against Corruption on the 24th of September 2008, and the MACC is the central agency that is actually established to protect whistleblowers. And the MACC has also lamented that there are very, very few cases of whistleblowers actually coming forward to lodge reports. And I must say that Section 6 of the MACC the Whistleblower Protection Act and the mandate that's given to enforcement agencies, including the MACC, actually means that a person can only lodge a report to an enforcement agency. So in the case of Lalita, how was it even possible that she would actually lodge a report to the MACC about possible potential alleged malpractice of the Chief Commissioner himself? So this entire episode actually points to the fact of how inadequate whistleblower protection is in Malaysia. And Lalita is not the first whistleblower that has been attacked. We've had many cases before, including the case of Rafizi Ramli that's gone to court, including many other whistleblowers who have faced tremendous reprisals, risk to their personal security, safety, employment issues in which there were career issues of actually not being able to scale up the corporate ladder, and so many cases that has now allowed for the Prime Minister's Department, the law ministry within the Prime Minister's Department, to actually look at several amendments. So the Lalita case has actually brought to light so many issues within the poor protection or almost no protection of whistleblowers in Malaysia, even though we have the Act.
Cynthia, could you help us understand the distinction that people might make between, say, investigative journalists, a politician, and you mentioned Rafizi Ramli earlier, and his role, in the public sphere, as it were, and somebody who's a whistleblower who are actually, as I understood it, is somebody who is kind of in the inside institutionally and is privy to wrongdoing and therefore comes out to expose, wrongdoing. Does the legislation make a distinction between all these types of individuals and their institutional positions, or do you lump them all as whistleblowers?
Well, that's a very important question, because if you look at the Act itself and also globally, there's a big elimination of investigative journalists to not be included as whistleblowers because of the fact that the exposés are done publicly and via the media. So it means that they themselves are exposing who is actually writing about a particular malpractice or bringing fraud to light, bringing fraud to public attention. But the realization now, even globally, not just in Malaysia, is that more and more corruption scandals are being exposed by investigative journalists. And the work of investigative journalists are so very important and so very critical to fight corruption that there are efforts to actually include them. Right now, technically, they are not included as whistleblowers. Whistleblowers, there's a very narrow definition of who can actually receive protection. Under our law, for example, I think I just wanted to actually take us through several sections. Like just now I mentioned Section 6, where you can only go to a law enforcement agency to report. And a whistleblower under Section 7 and Section 8 are actually allowed protection, including protection from confidential information, immunity from civil and criminal action, and protection against detrimental action or reprisals, only if you qualify within the very confined limits of whistleblower protection, that you go to the enforcement agency, you lodge a report, then you can receive protection, provided that you cannot even report it to, say, a member of parliament. And one of the biggest frustrations of a whistleblower is they are not updated of their case. So in a particular example of, say, an environmental issue, if there was a factory spewing black smoke and air pollution, and someone reports about the factory, and then they get some kind of a threat, etc., and then there's no action taken by the authorities over that whole incident, there's a lot of fear that the whistleblowers will be uncovered despite the protection, and that they will say go to their MP or go to their state assembly representative, and they will immediately lose protection. So it is a good thing, and I think I need to recognize the fact that the ministry, the law ministry of the Prime Minister's department has actually picked up a number of points that needs to be amended in the Whistleblower Protection Act. And CIFA also sits on that particular task force to recommend to them the different sections. So not everyone is now recognized as a whistleblower, including
so in the case, Cynthia, in the case of Lalita, then, you mentioned that there's a very narrow definition or in terms that you have to fall under the category of whistleblower to get protection under the Whistleblower Act. And that would protect you from civil action. But if Lalita is not kind of under that category, then what do you make of the fact that Azam Baki had, in fact, issued this letter of demand to her? I think he's asking for a public apology. He's asking to remove those articles and to pay 10 million ringgit in damages for tarnishing his reputation. I'm just wondering how we should go about thinking about that. The idea of the whistleblower protection versus the a person who is aggrieved and their legal and constitutional right to file a civil suit for defamation.
Well, we actually are made to understand that she had actually written to him before the articles went viral, and there was apparently no response from the ABCC or the Chief Commissioner himself. So technically she may not be, but the whole spirit of the law means that she actually should be protected. And Azam Baki himself, as the Chief Commissioner, who has gone public on various times to actually speak about the need to also get more people to report on corruption, should not actually have taken this action so quickly, because investigations are still taking place, and he had gone on a press conference and actually admitted that his brother had used his trading account, etc., etc. So there was no real reason to actually use this kind of fear tactics. So in the spirit of the law, she should be protected. I just wanted to say one or two very, very quick things, that this law is subservient to the Official Secrets Act. So, for example, if Lalita, in her case, she had used all publicly available documents. But if you're actually exposing something which is a classified document, you can be charged and you can not receive protection under the Whistleblower Protection Act. So that also includes the Banking and Financial Act and a few other acts that actually make it very difficult, including Section 203 of the Criminal Procedure Code that punishes civil servants from actually revealing information. So the case of Lalita actually shows that there's an urgent need to reform the Whistleblower Protection Act and actually reform and revamp the entire Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission Act.
Cynthia, when you look at this whole saga as it unfolded, and I think a lot of ordinary Malaysians would always remember the ways in which the establishment operates in this country. They draw the wagons around, and they take a very defensive position, issuing exonerations on the fly, and also pledging loyalty. There's a very interesting culture within the Malaysian establishment when they are scrutinized and their behavior is scrutinized. Is this something that is a kind of long-term problem for the fight against corruption? The fact that there is very little desire for scrutiny to be imposed, or rather scrutiny to be directed at the very institutions that are, have been created to protect us.
Thank you, Sharat. I think that whole question equals to one word: zero accountability in the culture of how many of our public institutions operate. And it is really critical that Malaysians as a whole actually need to keep blowing the whistle, or need to keep upping the ante to ensure that more and more people will hold power to account. Because many of these persons who are appointed to power are also appointed without sufficient public scrutiny. Many are appointed at the whims and fancies of those in high positions of power, or at the prerogative of the Prime Minister, without any real public scrutiny. So there is very little realization that there has to be accountability to the public. And it isn't just about whistleblowers in many ways, but it's also about taxpayers' funds being used. And if there is malpractice, which the Auditor General has pointed out over and over again in his reports, for example, there is no real mechanism to hold power to account. That people who had committed wrong and crimes should actually be punished. So this whole concept of punitive action is not something that's readily accepted or introduced in the culture of governance in our country, and that needs to be changed. And I just wanted to say that we have had 3 governments in 3 years, and although whistleblower protection, the reform of the MECC Act, everything has been thrown into the National Anti-Corruption Plan, a huge comprehensive plan. But we are sort of like really in a very despondent situation now. We don't know where all these reform measures are. And this entire episode of the MECC actually should be a wake-up call for us to pick up those reforms again and to ensure that there's some seriousness from the lawmakers and from the very government today to actually adhere and respect to these reforms that the Pakatan Harapan government had put into a national anti-corruption plan, and it's all in a state of disarray today.
Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Cynthia Gabriel of the C4 Center there. We're going to take a quick break here on Consider This. More in just a few minutes. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
nak dengar berita.
Sihat je. Rindu sangat kat korang. Cuk. Mama dah tengok movie baru dekat Disney Plus Hotstar.
Tak ada ke, Dik?
Kan Mama ada movies like Astro. Disney Plus Hotstar dah termasuk sekali dalam tu.
Macam mana nak tengok ya?
Astro ada SMS Mama tak? Mama klik kat link tu, confirmkan nombor telefon Mama. Lepas tu dah. Siap?
Aktif dah.
Senangnya. Kenapa selama ni tak beritahu Mama?
Di Kawasan memang dah janji, kereta kami bebas daripada kemalangan, kerosakan rangka, kebakaran dan banjir. Bila kami hantarkan terus ke rumah anda.
Pelbagai detik tercipta di atas lantai. Lindungi detik bermakna anda dengan disinfektan serbaguna Lifebuoy. Dengan bahan pembersih berunsurkan alam semula jadi. Ia membasmi kuman dan lembut pada kulit. Lifebuoy baru, efektif membasmi kuman, lembut pada anda.
Pure Swiss Hydrocalm Serum meningkatkan kelembapan kulit. Kulit menjadi lembap dan gebu sepanjang hari. Clinell.
Convicted of engaging in drug trafficking. Your mother was having trouble sleeping with while she's getting sober, so I'll be back in there soon.
What do you want from me? You need something, and you don't care how you get it.
You're sacrificing for your wife, Harold. Believe it or not, you got an ally in me. You're gonna need one.
The Red Road, siri-siri baru setiap Khamis di AXN.
Hi, you're watching Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris. With me is Sharad Kutan. The contributions of whistleblowers and investigative journalists in fighting endemic corruption are immense. But are we doing enough to value their contributions to good governance by affording them protections under legislation and in institutional response? Let's speak now to Gayatri Venkateswaran. She's an assistant professor at the School of Media, Languages and Cultures of University of Nottingham, Malaysia. Gaya, investigative journalist Lalita Kunaratnam, she's been issued a letter of demand by the MACC chief Azam Baki, this following the publication of two of her articles which raised questions surrounding his acquisition of shares in public listed companies. I'm just wondering your initial thoughts. What did you make of this sequence of events and reactions?
Good evening, Melissa, Sharad. Thanks for having me. Really, as a body that is entrusted precisely to combat corruption, the action by the head himself to issue such legal threat is testimony to the fact that, as Cynthia also said, it's an environment that's hostile towards any questions of accountability and governance. And if you look at the reporting that was done by Lalita, it actually does not make the kind of suggestions that is being alluded to in the letter of demand, because it's really presenting what is in fact public information. Yeah, to say that look, there are questions from the public because there have been certain questions raised as to the integrity of the body itself and the leaders of MACC. What do you do next with that? You take that sort of hypothesis or sort of basis of doubts, and you do an investigation and you find out. As a journalist, you go and explore and you find out where, if any, there are these wrongdoings. So I think it's it's in fact a very basic level of providing and collating public information to show where public bodies, the entrusted individuals, how do they fit into this picture of good governance? I think it's opening up a can of worms that clearly the head of MECC did not want, right, and wants to sort of nip it in the bud in that sense through the legal challenge. I mean, trying to sue journalists and take action against the media has become so much of this playbook in many governments to say, and of course Malaysian governments to really stop any kind of investigation. So I really think that the initial thought was that obviously you have something to hide, right? If your first course of action or response is to issue a legal threat. Legal threat is one of the most serious, most used forms of, I suppose, post-publication censorship repression against any media, against any journalist that's trying to sort of, tackle issues of accountability and governance.
Guy, I guess there are people who say that he has a right to protect his reputation, and perhaps even the quantum, 10 million, which is an extraordinary sum, considering how poorly journalists are paid in this country. The larger question, I mean, in some ways, a slightly different question I want to ask you, which is to do with her work itself. The ability for somebody like her, trained as an accountant, worked in a bank for close to a decade, and then, of course, with C4 for a couple of years, the ability to do this kind of forensic work. Do you see that very often in Malaysia? And if not, why do you think there's an absence of this kind of investigative work in the country?
Yeah, you nailed that, Sharad, because it takes so much of resources, right? It takes so much of resources. It takes the expertise. It takes the patience. These are things that a lot of newsrooms often cannot invest in because of the expectations for daily news productions. And so, the daily news cycle really takes up a lot of this time and effort by journalists. And so to dedicate the resources and the people to do in-depth investigation, and it's something that you spend months, sometimes years trying to uncover. And it's going through documents, it's going through so many other, paper trail, electronic trails, people trails, and all that. And so it is definitely a challenge. And that's why you see in many examples in Malaysia, you have a mix of either politicians or research centers or NGOs in collaboration, right? Often in collaboration because it requires so much of resources. So it is something that we don't often see, not because there are no cases, but can people actually spend the time, the energy, the money in order to do all of this? So you're right in that she has got that background, she's got that training, she's probably got the eyes for, looking at numbers, which, on a day-to-day, a lot of journalists are not able to spend that much of time. So, just also coming back to whether it's a question of protecting reputation, you're a public official, particularly to combat corruption, and you ought to be far more responsive and transparent, actually, compared to many others in the public sector. I mean, to say that you have a reputation to protect as a public servant that's holding the trust of the public, I think it's also being very interpreting the law in a very, very narrow way. But it's very unfortunate that in Malaysia, public servants and public officials, given court cases, seem to have the opportunity to claim that reputation as grounds for their court case. But just
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, I mean, the lack of, say, having dedicated investigative journalist teams or desks in news organizations, I think has been on the decline in recent years. But without the adequate protection for whistleblowers to come through official channels, that could also hinder some people from speaking up when they see wrongdoing or misconduct in corporate or in the private sector. Can I ask you, Gaia, then, what do you think social media has done to this? Because we see with anonymous Twitter accounts like Edisi Jasad, making these claims or pointing out what they think are wrongdoing in public interest. Do you think that social media changes the game for whistleblowers and what kind of protections are afforded to them?
Well, definitely the social media puts a lot of pressure on, the institutions and also the media, right? I mean, often, and, I think you experience that too, you have to keep up with what's actually on social media because it's a much wider base with people, who may have access to information because they're connected, they are related to people who work in different offices and agencies, and everyone is walking around with a phone, and you can record many things. So it offers two things. One, a kind of, keeping the officials possibly on the edge because, they could be exposed, if at all they think it's a threat to them, unless they think they're immune. But on the second, not flip side per se, but how does one establish if these exposés or discussions are, based on something that's credible, right? And I think it points us to two other sort of circumstances. One, there is a general lack of trust in public institutions in Malaysia. I mean, study after study, surveys after surveys will show that public trust in and faith in public institutions is not really that great in Malaysia. So we are from a starting point where there's so much of suspicion, there's so much of doubt in these public institutions. That's one. Second, how do we sort of, I think you asked a question earlier about defining the roles of, different actors, right? Whistleblowers, are they sources of information? Are they, in fact, the one who's reporting? I think with social media, what it tells us is that we have to rethink how we define people, because by sticking to very old definitions, we may lose out a lot of very, very valuable and useful, resources, right, and sources themselves. And so actually today, a journalist is someone who's not only confined to a particular organization, because they could actually be working independently and work in collaboration with other groups as well. A whistleblower, refers to sources, but also someone who may be responsible for writing part of the story, right, as Cynthia mentioned. So it does force us to rethink, in fact, labels and definitions, because the environment is so much more dynamic, that information can come from anywhere. But at the heart of it, one has to verify all of this. And to be able to verify, there must be frameworks for protection, must be frameworks for verification of information, and also accountability. I mean, I don't know who's behind Edisi Siasat, maybe some people know, but by throwing doubts, some of it could be based on authentic information, maybe some is not, we don't know. But the fact is, it has to be investigated if there is an interest to keep the reputation of the institution, not individuals, but the institution.
Guy, do you think, this particular episode, will signal the death knell of, investigative journalism, just because the very institutions that were designed to protect these people, journalists and whistleblowers, have turned against them?
It's true, but I think we are far more resilient than that. I think we've seen episodes in the past where it's the state themselves that are, all these blocks. And yet it hasn't, completely put people into a cowering position. I mean, I think people fight, people raise, because there's a shared transparency and accountability. Maybe not enough in terms of getting a mass support, but there are enough people who believe that is something that is worth fighting for. I think that this episode actually tells us that we've got a lot of things to fix, but I think I'm a little bit more hopeful that there are different actors, particularly collaborating across different, sort of media, civil society. I think that's actually positive about. So I'm probably a little bit more optimistic that it might inspire rather than frighten.
Okay. On that note, Gaya, we want to thank you so much for joining us on the show. Gayatri Venkateswaran from University of Nottingham, Malaysia, wrapping up this episode of Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris.
And I'm Sharad Kuttan, signing off the evening.
Thank you so much for watching. Good night.
Good night.